speaking in English. It is a bad, I have a serious language problem. I'm about to marry someone who's German. Yet speak no German. So next time I come, I will speak in German. Maybe. This talk is going to focus on one piece of research, but I really want to not make it a research talk, but a general talk about cognitive behavior therapy and perhaps psychotherapy in general. When I was in my study, my office, thinking about what I should talk about, I thought that I'd like to talk about address three questions. The first is, what does CBT target? What is it trying to change? What is it a treatment for? The second is an interesting question of, do complex problems require complex solutions? And the third is, how can we best improve response rates when we treat people? How can we get more people better? So starting with question one. And for that, I need to say something about eating disorders, just to remind you of a few things. Eating disorders are classified into three categories: anorexia nervosa, the thin ones; bulimia nervosa, people with recurrent binge eating, usually followed by vomiting or taking laxatives. These people are normal weight. And a residual category, a remaining category, called eating disorder NOS, for everyone else who has an eating disorder of clinical severity. It was only realized about 5 or so years ago that the diagnostic distribution of cases, more or less wherever you are, is like this in adults. That the least common eating disorder is anorexia nervosa. Next is bulimia nervosa, but the most common category is the so-called residual category, which should be small. It is actually the biggest category in the eating disorders. And most of these people have the clinical features of anorexia and bulimia mixed up together. They are mixed cases. They're like a mixture of anorexia and bulimia. The research and clinical literature on eating disorders treats these diagnoses as if they were entirely separate conditions. These are separate psychiatric disorders. And there's been research on them. Most of the treatment research is on bulimia. And there is a very large amount of research on the treatment of bulimia. It's in fact one of the most studied psychiatric disorders in terms of treatment. And the research is very clear that the leading form of treatment for bulimia is a specific type of cognitive behavior therapy, or CBT. But it only gets 40 to 50% of people who complete treatment fully better in a lasting way. So it's only 40 to 50% of people who complete treatment make a full, lasting response. If we think about anorexia nervosa, and again thinking about adults, there's actually no evidence-based treatment for adults with anorexia nervosa, which is shocking, really. And there's actually been no research on the most common category, eating disorder NOS. So clearly, in terms of treatment, if one works as a clinician living in the real world, there are several problems here. One problem is that the treatment for bulimia is getting less than half the people better, and that's the best treatment. We have no evidence-based treatment for anorexia and no research on eating disorder NOS. Now, a question that puzzled us in Oxford quite about 5 to 10 years ago was this one. Why are we distinguishing anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and NOS? Why do we accept these diagnoses? I'd like to suggest it's a historical accident. It's just the way things are. They don't need to be like this. These distinctions have no basis in terms of research. They're just handed down from generation to generation. If you lived on Mars, the planet Mars, and looked down on Earth and looked at the people with eating disorders, I'd suggest that you wouldn't necessarily want to divide them up like this. That say you would think this was strange what we're doing, cutting the diagnosis, if you like, eating disorders this way. In clinical reality suggests we should do something different. Because what's most striking about people with eating disorders is how similar they are to each other. They're mainly young women. They mainly develop in their teenage years. The clinical features are shared across the eating disorders. Extreme dieting of a very characteristic form, calorie counting, weighing food, measuring food, vomiting, taking laxatives, driven exercising, extreme concerns about shape and weight, body checking. All these features are shared across anorexia nervosa, bulimia nervosa, and EDNOS. They're the same clinical features. They're not seen in any other disorder. They're shared across these disorders. And it's just the relative balance of them dictates whether you're underweight or normal weight, whether you're in anorexia, bulimia, or EDNOS. So we're cutting this, if you like, population up in a way that may not make sense. Then there's an interesting phenomenon of diagnostic migration. When patients come to see us, they are diagnosed like this, but if you follow them over time, they change diagnosis. It's a strange phenomenon. Most patients change diagnosis over time. It's as if they haven't read the diagnostic book. They're not sticking to their diagnosis. They're disobeying DSM and ICD. Most patients move across the diagnoses over time. They don't change to another psychiatric class of disorders. They just move within the eating disorders. Now, last week I saw a patient she was 35, I think, or 36 years old. Her eating disorder started with anorexia when she was about 17. She had anorexia for about 4 years, then started binge eating, her weight came up, and her diagnosis changed to bulimia nervosa by the time she was 20. Throughout her 20s, she had bulimia nervosa. And then her binges changed in size slightly, and her frequency of vomiting went right up, but the size of the binges went down. It meant she no longer met diagnostic criteria for bulimia nervosa, and now she met criteria for EDNOS, eating disorder, NOS. And now she's 35. Am I to tell this lady that she's had 3 separate psychiatric disorders? She first had anorexia nervosa, then completely recovered from that, and developed a new psychiatric disorder called bulimia nervosa. And then completely recovered from that, and now has developed a 3rd separate psychiatric disorder called eating disorder NOS. Or am I to tell her she's had 1 evolving eating disorder that's just changed over time? Do you see what I mean? It doesn't make much sense dividing up the eating disorders into categories like this, when actually they've shared features and people move between them. So this is an interesting phenomenon. It's not seen in other psychiatric disorders, this movement. It has theoretical implications. It suggests that there are mechanisms that keep you having an eating disorder, but not a particular eating disorder. In other words, you're locked into having an eating disorder, but not specific specifically anorexia, bulimia, or agnos. Clinically, it suggests if you have a treatment for one eating disorder, it might well work for them all. If you can treat bulimia, that treatment probably will work for anorexia and agnos, because you're treating the same psychopathology. It's the same clinical phenomena across the disorders. So if you can treat those phenomena in one disorder, it should work across the disorders. This is a prediction. And this is what lay behind our recent work, this prediction that if we can treat bulimia, maybe we could just change the treatment slightly, and this treatment should work across all the eating disorders. It should be a transdiagnostic treatment. So what does CBT target? CBT is not a treatment for a diagnosis, it's a treatment for psychopathology. That's a very important point. We don't have treatments for DSM diagnoses. We have treatments for panic attacks, or we have treatment for PTSD, but we're talking about clinical phenomena. In this case, we have the CBT for bulimia nervosa is a treatment for binge-eating, vomiting, and extreme concerns about shape and weight. It's for that psychopathology. And if psychopathology straddles diagnostic boundaries, then the treatment may be useful across diagnostic boundaries. And that's what we wanted to look at, is whether we could use a single form of CBT and treat all eating disorders. In other words, could it be transdiagnostic? The treatment is called CBT-E, it's an enhanced CBT. We wrote about the theory behind it about 6 years ago, and slightly to our surprise, it's one of the most downloaded papers in psychiatry and psychology. I think the word transdiagnostic may be attracting people to read this, because the paper isn't that interesting. It's just a good title. We've written a book describing how to do the treatment, and the important thing about the book is it's describing how to treat eating disorder psychopathology, not diagnoses. So it's a book that describes designing a treatment to fit the individual patient's problems, not a diagnostic category. So that each person's treatment may be slightly different from the next patient's treatment. It's designed to fit them like a suit is designed to fit you. It's meant to be tailored to the patient. Now, for the purpose of the talk, I need to just say one more thing about the treatment, and that is it comes in two forms. One form of the treatment only tries to change the eating disorder psychopathology. It just focuses on the eating disorder features. That's the focused form of the treatment. And then there's a broad form of the treatment that also addresses some common obstacles to change amongst patients with eating disorders. These are what we call mood intolerance. This has been very sensitive to changes in your mood, and having to neutralize them. Most of these patients will be said to have borderline personality disorder. Clinical perfectionism is extreme perfectionism, so extreme that you can't function well. Core low self-esteem means no self-esteem. You think you're worthless as a person. And major relationship problems are another obstacle to change amongst some people. So there's a focused version of the treatment that just focuses on eating disorder, and a broad version of the treatment that also addresses these other clinical features. That's the background. Now I'll just say something about a study we've done. It was done in two places, in England, Oxford and Leicester, and took us about 7 years. involved quite a lot of collaboration. It was expensive and is published. And if you want to read about it, it's in the American Journal of Psychiatry in March this year. You can just download it. And it might seem boring for me to describe a study that's out, but I want to explain why the study is of general interest. So we wanted to see if this single form of treatment, CBT-E, which was originally a treatment for bulimia, could be used across the eating disorders. We also had to try to make it more potent than the old form of treatment, make it more effective. So we wanted to see how good it was as well. I'm going to be telling you mainly, there were actually two studies, and I'm going to focus mainly, talk about the first study, which was of patients who had a body mass index over 17.5. That's outside the anorexia range, so the people who weren't severely underweight. We have done the Underweight Study too, which I can tell you about if you wish. We wanted to see if the treatment response of people with bulimia nervosa differed from the treatment response of people with EGNOS. No one's ever studied the treatment of eating disorder NOS. If we're saying this is a separate group of people, presumably they respond differently to treatment, because that's usually the reason you make a distinction. We also wanted to compare the broad and focused forms of the treatment. Everywhere I go, therapists want to learn how to do the broad version of the treatment. It's sexy, it's clever, and that's fair enough, but we better show it's better. Because really, you should use the simplest treatment that helps patients recover. Just as you enjoy the treatment, it doesn't mean it's the best treatment for that patient. The sample was what's called an effectiveness sample. This means that we tried to have a real-world sample of patients. And so where I work in the county of Oxford in England, and our Leicester group in another part of England, we take all patients with eating disorders. There's no other service. Every patient with an eating disorder is treated by us. There aren't any other hospitals, there aren't any other clinics. It's the British National Health Service eating disorder service for these two parts of England. So we take all patients and we try to enter them all into this treatment study. With the only exclusion criteria were that if you weren't available for treatment, so you were going to move away in 3 months, that would exclude you. And if you were pregnant, otherwise you were in the trial. That meant we had a lot of comorbidity. The trial took a lot of people who were normally excluded from studies. So very high rates of depression, OCD, and other psychiatric disorders. Of course, multiple axis 2, personality disorders. We also had a lot of people with general medical problems, diabetes, for example, and other health problems. Everyone was basically in the study. So study 1 is of this proportion of patients from 2 geographical areas. It's about 80 to 85% of patients. Study 2 is of the very underweight people, the yellow bit. I'm talking about the red. And as expected, the proportion of bulimia nervosa was about a third. The rest were EGNOS, even sort of NOS. In terms of their characteristics, they were in their mid-20s, mid to late 20s, mainly female, mainly single. The average duration of eating disorder, 8 to 9 years. And most people had 1, 2, or 3 prior treatments that hadn't worked. So this is just what we see in England. If you have an eating disorder service, this is the sort of people see if you treat adults. So I'm going to give you just a very quick review of the results. Now I'm going to show a series of graphs, and they're all going to look the same. There's going to be a treatment phase that lasted 20 weeks, and then what's called a closed follow-up, where people had no treatment at all, and we just watched what happened over the following 60 weeks. That's over more than a year. So the idea is to see what's the impact of treatment, and then do the treatment effects last, or do people relapse, or maybe continue to get better. You're going to see red lines and yellow lines. Red lines are bulimia nervosa. And this is just showing you a decrease in eating disorder features amongst people with bulimia nervosa. And there's a decrease, but it doesn't mean much, so I'll explain a bit more in a minute. And the yellow lines are NOS, the people with eating disorder NOS. They start the same and end the same. The solid lines are one of the forms of treatment, and the dotted lines are the other form of treatment, broad and focused. You can see all these lines are just overlapping. This graph's a bit more interesting. This proportion of people who level of eating disorder features is no different from that in the community. They've come right out of a clinical level of eating disorder features and into community levels of eating disorder features. It's a tough criterion to meet. This is difficult to be that well. This between 40 and 60% of people with 20 weeks of treatment, on average, an 8-year history, are outside the eating disorder range in terms of eating disorder features at the end of treatment. That's very high. Same with NOS, identical treatment response. And this is just a drop in general psychiatric features in the two groups as well. Now to follow up, all these studies, the crucial thing is to follow up. Eating disorders are famous for relapsing. It's easy to get someone better for a short time, and don't congratulate yourself at the end of treatment. Congratulate yourself 6 months or a year later, because relapse is very common. So we had a reasonably long follow-up. We followed people up at 20, 40, and 60 weeks. That's long enough to see when most relapses. We did very high compliance with the assessments. That were 95% of the assessments were conducted with face-to-face interviews by raters who had nothing to do with treatment. And it was, as I said, a closed follow-up. So no one was having any extra treatment unless it was essential clinically. And there were 10 of those people out of a sample of 160. So, severity of eating disorder features over the following year. There's the bulimia nervosa group. There's the NOS group. In other words, the changes are maintained in both populations. There's no continuing improvement, but nor is there deterioration. This is a proportion of people who are right out of their eating disorder. In the bulimia nervosa group, this statistically is a straight line, and the NOS group, again, statistically is a straight line. So again, maintained change. Approximately 50% of people are completely well throughout the year-long follow-up. And with no exclusion criteria, more or less. And general psychiatric features, it's the same too. So, I think we concluded this clinically relevant sample that patients responded pretty well in terms of their general psychiatric features, in terms of their eating disorder features, and there was no difference at all between the patients with bulimia nervosa and and EDNOS, at any stage, they responded identically. So what can we conclude from this? One, well, these treatment response rates are higher than have ever been reported before, so it looks promising, especially given the sample, which is a much more complex sample than is normally studied. So we just put everyone in. And secondly, it is interesting that bulimia nervosa and EDNOS were no different at any point. Makes you wonder why we're distinguishing the two disorders, because it doesn't have any value, it seems. So, what does CBT target? This does suggest that CBT targets psychopathology, and if this psychopathology is present in a different diagnosis, like EDNOS, then if you can treat bulimia nervosa, you can treat EDNOS. This is a transdiagnostic treatment, not a treatment just for bulimia. Now, I want to move on quite quickly to the interesting question of, do complex problems require complex solutions? Eating disorders are generally regarded as complex. And as I mentioned at the beginning, we devised one form of CBT-E to address the sort of complexity that's commonly found amongst people with eating disorders. Mood intolerance, extreme perfectionism, low self-esteem, or major relationship problems. This was very much designed for the most complex group of patients. So the question is this version of the treatment, the one that's sexy, goes for complexity, better than the focus form of the treatment, which ignores that and just focuses on the eating disorder? Well, you saw all those lines, and if you looked at all those lines, they were all travelling beside each other on the graphs. So within the complete patient sample, there was no evidence of any difference in effectiveness between the focused and broad versions of the treatment. Therefore, there is no reason to do the broad version of the treatment, because the simple version is just as good. Less is more. Simple is as good, so why go complex? But there is a but here. But. And the but is an analysis we planned from the outset, and it takes a little bit of explanation. The first bit of explanation is in relation to the treatments. The broad and focused forms of the treatment are the same for the first 4 weeks. The first 4 weeks of the treatment are identical. Then they diverge, and the broad one moves off into tackling mood intolerance or perfectionism, as well as the eating disorder, whereas the focused one just stays on the eating disorder. In this trial, the therapists, for the first 4 weeks, did not know which treatment the patient was going to have. They just treated the patient during the first 4 weeks of the treatment. And then after the first 4 weeks, they were told, this patient is going to have the focused form, or this patient is going to have the broad form. And that was dictated by randomization by a computer. So for the first 4 weeks, the therapist did not know what was going to happen next. But at the end of those 4 weeks, we asked the therapist to make a very specific rating of how complex was this patient. Does this patient show mood intolerance, perfectionism, core low self-esteem, or major relationship problems? They had to rate this at the end of the 4 weeks. And obviously, if the patient showed those features, clinically you'd want to do the broad version of the treatment, and maybe if they didn't, you might think the focused was good enough. So we had these ratings, And we divided the sample into complex patients and less complex patients. And I wanted to show you the outcome for the patients divided up as to whether they were complex or not, as judged by a patient, by therapists who'd really known them well now. They'd seen them over 4 weeks and had 8 treatment sessions. Well, overall, this is the proportion of people making a full recovery. The less complex patients did better. 60% of the less complex patients came right out of their eating disorder and remained out of it during the follow-up period of 60 weeks. Whereas it's more like 40% of the complex patients responded. This is not surprising, really, though it's never been shown before. What I want to do now is look at the less complex group, which is 60% of patients, and see how did they do with the broad or focused versions of the treatment. Well, actually, there was a difference. So this difference moves in and out of statistical significance, but it's consistent. And the difference was that the focused treatment was better. Less was more. The simpler version of the treatment was better than the more complex version of the treatment with the less complex patients. Hope you're following me. If I was listening to this in German, I would be lost. Okay, now let's think about the more complex patients. Again, there's a difference. Again, it's moving in and out of statistical significance, but it's consistent. And here, it reverses. Here, for the patients with mood intolerance, perfectionism, low self-esteem, or major relationship problems, the broad version of the treatment looked better. So hidden inside the overall results, where the treatments look the same, is an interesting difference. That complex patients, who were about 40% of the sample, did better with the broader version of the treatment. But the majority of the patients, 60% of the sample, did better with the focused version of the treatment. So overall, the message